The U.S.-led invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq have shifted the geopolitical landscape of both Central Asia and the Middle East. At the crux of both neighborhoods is the Islamic Republic of Iran, a longtime adversary of American interests and a country U.S. President George Bush famously labeled part of an axis of evil. Iran has recently come under fire for its decision to resume, despite strong opposition from the international community, a nuclear program most agree has military potential. How will Iran's decision, as well as the U.S. occupation of neighboring Iraq, affect the future of the region? Understanding Iran, coming up next on Great Decisions 2006.
Join us as Great Decisions Television celebrates 20 years of inspiring Americans to learn more about the world. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Starr Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust. And now from our studio at New York University, here is Ralph Begleiter.
The United States officially severed ties with Iran in 1980 after the Iran hostage crisis, during which student radicals stormed the U.S. embassy and held its employees hostage for 444 days. 2.5 decades later, Iran overwhelmingly elected as president a man some have accused of taking part in the U.S. embassy takeover, former mayor of Tehran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. His ultra-conservative stance may mean prospects for improving U.S.-Iran relations during his administration are dimmer than ever. He also takes power amid escalating tensions on the nuclear front. Iran recently decided to resume uranium conversion, it says for peaceful purposes. But the international community suspects Iran's nuclear program is a precursor to nuclear weapons. 3 European Union countries, Britain, Germany, and France, have taken the lead in negotiating with Iran for full suspension of its nuclear program, a demand Tehran has repeatedly refused. Along with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Europeans hope to find a solution through dialogue, offering economic incentives, fuel supplies for Iran, and security guarantees in exchange for a complete abandonment of nuclear activities. But the Europeans threaten to ask the United Nations Security Council for action if Iran continues processing uranium. Going to the UN is backed by the U.S., though top American officials continue to insist all options remain on the table. Despite decades of tension, the U.S. and Iran do have shared interests, not least of which is Iran's strategic location at the Persian Gulf oil bottleneck. Both countries would like to see stability in Iraq and an end to the 2-year-long Sunni-led insurgency. But Iran and the U.S. have vastly different ideas of what a new Iraq should look like. The U.S. would like to see a multi-ethnic federal democracy, friendly to American interests. But many believe Iran is pushing for a Shia-led government that embraces Islamic law and holds strong ties to Tehran, increasing Iran's influence in the Gulf. If negotiators fail to reach an agreement on Iran's nuclear program, will the dispute end up at the United Nations? How would that affect the subtle push and pull between the U.S. and Iran over the future of Iraq? Joining us today to untangle these issues and more are University of Michigan Professor of Modern Middle East and South Asian History, Juan Cole, who also authors the widely read weblog Informed Comment, and Ervand Abrahimian, City University of New York Distinguished Professor and Iran Specialist at the Department of History at the Weissman School of Arts and Science at Baruch College. Welcome to you both. The dispute over Iran's nuclear program has really been at the heart of U.S.-Iranian tensions and Israeli-Iranian tensions for a long time. What's your assessment at this point of whether Iran wants a military program or a civilian electricity program?
Well, Washington is convinced Iran is intending to build a nuclear weapon. Iran is adamant that it has absolutely no intention. And paradoxically, I think both are right in that Iran is not in a position yet to even have the option of going nuclear weaponry. Iran is still basically doing research and development for nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. But the problem is there is no clear line between the two. Iran hasn't reached that position where it can go one further and develop actual nuclear weapons. But along the line, somewhere in the future, probably in 4 or 5 years, it will have that. It would have reached that line. And the U.S. concern is that when that line comes, Iran will actually go for nuclear weapons. I think what Iran is probably intending to do is what's known in the field as the Japanese option, which is you don't actually build a bomb, but you have the components, you have the knowledge, and the ability to build a bomb if you need to. So you have assembled everything, and at some point, if another war comes, then you can actually, within a few months, quickly assemble a bomb. Iran would like to have that option of being in that position, which I think something like 30 countries in the world are already in that position. So it really wants to guarantee its security for the future of not having the bomb itself right now, but having the possibility of creating a bomb in case of an emergency.
Juan Cole, your assessment?
Well, these things are opaque. The Iranians do have a nuclear energy program. At the moment, they do not have the ability to build a bomb. They haven't completed the fuel cycle. They can't produce fissionable material. Whether at some point in the future they may have that capability is hard to know. I think that's the real issue here, is that this is a long-term and not a short-term problem. This is a problem for 10, 15 years out. It's not something that desperately needs crisis management at the moment. It needs negotiation. The world has to decide if it wants an Iran with a nuclear capability. But it's not something, some people think that it's so near that military action, for instance, would be desirable. I think that simply is not true.
How did Iran get its original nuclear capability in the first place?
Well, the United States back in the 1950s had something called Atoms for Peace, and it actually went around the world encouraging countries to develop nuclear energy and promoting the industry for financial reasons, because the U.S. was a leader in the nuclear industry at that time. And so both in Baghdad and in Iran, the United States promoted Atoms for Peace and encouraged these countries to get reactors. And when the Shah of Iran was an ally of the United States, in the 1970s, he developed nuclear reactors down at Bushehr, which were light water reactors. Those are much, much more difficult to use for military purposes.
And so some of that technology is American technology?
Certainly the impetus for it came originally from the United States.
Now, in the region, you mentioned the Japanese option as being able to be close to, but not quite there, to a nuclear weapon, as something Iran might favor. In the Middle East, it's widely assumed that Israel is at that stage as well, that it has the capability, if not actually the weapons, to deploy at any moment. Why shouldn't another country in the Middle East have that option?
On a moral level, you can't argue against it. I mean, proliferation has already taken place. Pakistan has it. I don't think it becomes the early question of who should and shouldn't have. It's more obviously a political question. Who can be trusted? And in an ideal world, of course, disarmament should be what we should all want.
So why is the United Nations, why are the Europeans and the Americans at this point discussing taking this issue to the United Nations Security Council if it's not really possible to make that decision?
Well, I think the pressure comes from mainly the United States, that the United States sees Iran as basically not so much a rival power, but a power that it can't control in the region. And therefore, it would not want this power to have, obviously, the possibility of having a nuclear weapon.
What would happen if the Security Council said to Iran, you can't have a nuclear weapon, we're going to impose sanctions on you, take other actions perhaps? What other actions could the UN take if it had that opportunity?
Well, I think the end result would be an economic boycott on Iran, possibly on Iranian petroleum.
Isn't there one already in place to a very large extent?
It's not an international boycott. The United States has a boycott on Iran. since there are two things wrong with these boycott ideas. First of all, petroleum is what we call fungible. It's easily transferred around, and it's easily sold. It's easily turned into cash. So it doesn't really matter where it comes from. The French have this phrase that money has no smell, and in a way, petroleum doesn't have a smell. And the United States, even at the height of its enmity with Saddam Hussein, was actually importing oil that originated in Iraq. And so an economic boycott of Iran would be very difficult to pull off in such a way as to actually have a big effect, I think, on the regime.
You don't think it would be effective against Iran?
No, because the oil would simply be smuggled and sold under other auspices, and it would be, and then since it's a state-owned industry, the government gets the money from it no matter how it's sold. So the regime could cushion itself just as Saddam Hussein did.
One of the arguments the United States makes currently about keeping Iran from developing further its nuclear program is, you've got all the oil in the world in Iran. What do you need energy? What do you need electric energy for? You can burn oil instead.
It's sort of actually ironical that the U.S. would use this argument, since we waste so much fuel here ourselves, so we're not exactly conservationists. But it's an argument that in Iran the Shah also used, that the limited supplies of oil, sooner or later it's going to actually dry up, and that to forestall that eventuality in about 20 years' time, Iran needs to have the alternative sources of energy, and nuclear is obviously the way to go.
Let me ask you the strategic question for just a second about this nuclear weapon. Let's assume for a moment that some years hence, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be, Iran actually has a nuclear weapon, able to put together a bomb. I think many people just automatically assume that bomb would be a threat to Israel, but are there other countries, are there others against whom Iran might conceivably use that weapon? Would it use it against the United States, for example?
No, I think actually the advantages of a nuclear weapon are much exaggerated. You can use it as a sort of threat, as defensive. If someone uses, let's say, a chemical warfare on you, like Saddam Hussein, that you have, it's something you can counter. But
so Iraq might be a target
if Iraq invaded again. But in terms of actually putting pressure on another country, it's in a way a bluff, because as leaders in Iran have stated, a nuclear bomb is not going to actually increase Iran's influence so much, and even in the Gulf, because what it could do is, let's say tomorrow Iran announced it had a bomb. What it would do would pressure a lot of the Gulf states to take shelter under an American umbrella. It would, in fact, alienate those countries from Iran. And that, obviously, Iran doesn't want to frighten off its neighbors to become more pro-American. As far as Israel is concerned, I think it's much exaggerated. Let's say Iran did have nuclear weapons and missiles. What's it going to do? Unless Iranian scientists develop a nuclear bomb that can kill Jews and not Muslims, it's not something you can drop on Jerusalem or Tel Aviv without causing incredible damage to the Arab neighborhood. So it's in many ways a paper weapon in real politics. But for insurance level, I think because of Iran's experience in the Iraq-Iranian war, the people whose formative years was that war, I wouldn't be surprised if they felt that this would be a sort of a major deterrent against future invaders.
Juan, how about the broader region? How about India and Pakistan, for example, which both have nuclear weapons? Would they feel threatened, deterred, or in some way incited by an Iranian nuclear weapon?
Well, in geopolitical terms, the question is which country Iran would side with in a conflict. In recent years, there's actually been an Iranian tilt towards New Delhi. So I think the Pakistanis would be very threatened by the development of Iranian bomb. It's certainly the case that the use of the bomb for warfare, for tactical warfare purposes, in a case where multiple countries have the weapon, it's probably impossible to use it that way. There's the doctrine of mutually assured destruction to think about. And it's widely thought that in 2002, India and Pakistan almost went to war twice, and that the thing that ultimately decided Delhi, especially, against entering such a war is they couldn't be sure where all the Pakistani nuclear weapons were, and it would only take mounting one of them on a jet for it to reach Delhi and kill 10 million people. So there is an argument among political scientists that the spread of these weapons actually would have the effect of cutting down on conventional warfare. The problem is that if they're wrong, then it's truly a disastrous mistake.
Let's step away from the nuclear weapon issue for just a moment, because Irvan raised some interesting questions about Iran's influence on the rest of the region, the Persian Gulf, the broader Middle East, and so on. But let's take the nuclear question out for a moment. The United States is engaged, obviously, at the moment, in intensive conflict in Iraq. What role is Iran playing vis-a-vis the Iraqis, vis-a-vis the division of Iraq, and how does that affect the United States' role and the likelihood of the U.S. to be able to get out of Iraq at some point? Irvan?
Well, since the U.S. invasion of Iraq, actually, Iran has been playing sort of very cool policy and very, I would say, cool-headed in that they've had good relations with almost every group in Iraq, including the Kurds. So the Kurdish president of Iraq, Taliban, is on very good terms with Iran. And Iran basically wants to have openings with almost every group there because they don't really know what's going to happen. So much depends on what U.S. does. U.S. is in the driver's seat, but they don't want to be basically left in the cold. So if things go worse for the United States, Iran would like to be in a position to take advantage of it. So it basically has kept good open doors with the main players in Iraq. The only group really doesn't have very close relations is the Shia group, the South's group, that is causing a great deal of trouble for the United States. They're sort of seen as a loose cannon from the Tehran's point of view. But as far as the two main Shia organizations, they were basically protected by Iran for the last 10 years. They were armed by Iran, financed by Iran. And
do they expect a payback for that? If things go badly for the U.S., would Iran control Iraq?
No, well, these groups are not really controlled by Iran, but they know they could depend on Iraq if things go badly.
On Iran?
Iran, yes.
Yeah. Juan, how do you see the Iranian role in the playing out of the situation in Iraq?
Well, the United States and Iran have had, since the U.S. invasion of Iraq, much the same interests. Both want Iraq to stay together as a united country, even if it has a rather loose federalism. Both are in favor of democratic forms of rule because the Iranians are aware that there's a Shiite majority in Iraq, and democracy guarantees that the Shiites would be able to exercise their political will. Both of them supported having these elections in January 30th, 2005. Both of them supported the Constitution, the referendum on the Constitution, the further parliamentary elections. Both of them have promoted Iraqi parties like the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, the Dawa Party. So I would argue that the United States and Iran have been tacit allies in overthrowing the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and shifting the basis of rule in that country. And yet, ironically enough, they engage in these continual shouting matches against one another and against the influence of each the other in Iraq.
Do you think it's possible that Iran might actually play a constructive role from the point of view of the United States and assist in making a federation inside Iraq actually work so that the U.S. would be able to withdraw?
Every evidence is that the Iranians want a federal united Iraq. You see, they don't want an independent Kurdistan because Iran has a Kurdistan, and they wouldn't want anything to happen that might encourage Iranian Kurds to want to join up and make a united Kurdistan with those in Iraq. So they desperately want Iraq to hold together. They want an Iraq that is democratic because then that ensures Shiite dominance in the country. So I would argue that all along the Iranians have played a relatively positive role in Iraq. They have pushed for more Islamic governance, but then they've found willing allies in Iraq for such principles, and that the United States and Iran, up to a point, have had similar interests. Now, of course, the Iranians have a further interest, which is that they do want the United States to withdraw from Iraq, and they want to recover Iraq for an Iranian sphere of influence. In fact, they talked about an alliance of Tehran, Baghdad, and Damascus.
I don't know if our viewers are aware of this, but for many years now, really since about 1980, American officials, diplomats, negotiators, economists, almost anybody in an official U.S. government capacity has been forbidden from even shaking hands with an Iranian official, much less engaging in some kind of substantive conversation. Is the U.S. cutting off its nose by being unwilling to talk with the Iranian government?
Well, it's been actually nuanced because over the Afghan crisis, the two worked together very much behind the scenes.
During the Afghanistan war, after the 9/11 attacks.
And in setting up the Karzai government in Kabul, actually, the two sides were working along parallel lines. And in Iraq, although they're not shaking hands, it's been clear that they have similar common interests. But I think where this ties into your earlier question about nuclear issue is, so far, I think Iran has, you can say, been constructive as far as the United States is concerned in Baghdad. But if Iran feels that U.S. is going to put a lot of pressure about the nuclear issue, even a strike on nuclear installations, that's where things can unravel. That's where I can see a major, basically, crisis brewing, because Iran has a great deal of assets in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and then it would be in its interest to use these assets.
What do you mean assets?
Well, supporters. I mean, for instance,
they could cause trouble for the U.S. in both Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes. And basically, they could, if we already in a nightmare situation in Iraq, it could become much worse if there's a Shia revolt there while we're dealing with a Sunni revolt. And there are people in Iraq, for instance, Saad, who would like to raise a Shia revolt. Iranians so far have been, telling him to shut up and be quiet. But if things change, they could very well say, give him a green light and say, we're going to support you rather than the other Shia groups we've in the past supported. So that's really something that it could really unravel the place very quickly.
One, should the U.S. open a formal channel of discussions with Iran?
I believe the U.S. missed a great opportunity after 1997 when President Khatami was elected. He urged people-to-people diplomacy and a kind of ping-pong policy reminiscent of how China and the United States ultimately established relations in the 1970s. And I don't believe the United States actually met that call with very warm response. There were always visa problems with having Iranians visit the United States in that period. And I think that could have been the beginning of a change in the relationship of the two countries. The United States policy towards Iran, in my view, is a little bit irrational. I think that there's an element of grudginess in U.S. policy towards Iran. This is the successor regime to the Khomeini regime, which was responsible for the taking of U.S. diplomats hostage, for actions against U.S. officials and installations in Lebanon. And there were a fair number of Americans killed in this, including Marines in Beirut. Probably the Iranians had a hand in that. And the loss of Iran as an American sphere of influence stung. And so I think there are a large number of career diplomats, people in the Defense Department and the CIA who remember these things with a great deal of bitterness. And it makes it very difficult for them as a group to approach Iran with new eyes and to see the changes that have occurred in the country after Khomeini's death.
I'd like to ask you about that question. Since you mentioned Lebanon, how much trouble is Iran still causing for the U.S., for Israel, in Lebanon, in Syria, vis-a-vis Israel? And is that something the Iranian government could do if it really wanted to establish new ties with the United States?
Well, in Lebanon, it's obviously with Hezbollah, Iran has good relations. Whether it controls,
are they troublemakers?
Well, Hezbollah's main interest was getting Israel out of Lebanon. Since then, actually, it's been basically a Lebanese organization. It is capable of causing problems, but so far has not. And so it's a sort of pressure on pressure that the influence Iran has on Hezbollah that could affect Israel, which then affects the United States. But it's not a direct influence Iran would have in the Mediterranean sphere.
It couldn't find a way to put a lid on some of the anti-Israeli violence across the border and maybe even within the West Bank?
Well, I think the dynamics there is internal. If Hamas wants to do something, there's very little Iran can do either to stop it or to encourage it. Iran itself likes to see itself as a major power, but I think in reality it has very little influence on that part of the Middle East.
A final word on that, Juan? What do you think?
Well, I think what drives Hezbollah to continue a relatively militant stance towards Israel, and it does fire rockets across the border, really is a matter of internal Lebanese politics. Hezbollah is a political party in Lebanon, and it competes in elections, and it's competing against the Amal party, which also tries to represent the southern Shiites. So I think that Hezbollah is attempting to play to the audience by being more militant, more nationalist. I don't think Iran has much to say about it.
Thanks very much, Juan Cole, University of Michigan Professor of Modern Middle East and South Asian History, and Ervan Abrahamian, City University of New York Distinguished Professor and Iran Specialist at the Department of History at the Weissman School of College of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. Thank you for being with us on Great Decisions 2006. Thank you as well for joining us. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Starr Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.